interview, and it really reminded me about this work across cultures, because you think of the shamanic tradition of going to the upper worlds, and it's very similar to what he was describing that these Buddhist meditators were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I have my bachelor's in anthropology, but I don't consider myself an anthropologist, but that's just ripe for a para-anthropology study to look at that cross-cultural near death, or, journey to the upper worlds, or whatever you want to call it. It's fascinating.
Well, I'd be happy to, facilitate a direct communication between you and William.
Yeah, it'd be great to have a conversation about it at the very least.
He seems like a serious researcher, and I'm under the impression that there is now a worldwide network of advanced Buddhist meditators who are also researchers and who are cooperating with him.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that came up for me in that interview was, he said multiple times, it's not about how many years of experience the meditator has, because, sometimes someone is just very skilled and can get into that deep concentrative state very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was doing my meditation research at Oregon Health and Science University, this was the major question that we were trying to figure out with EEG. Is there some sort of physiological correlate that we can say, okay, they're in a really great meditation now? Because we found the same thing. Someone might have meditated for 20 years and still have a really hard time having that focused attention. So I thought that was a really interesting point too, but I think they're getting closer. I mean, there's so many neuroscientists and various meditation researchers working on that question, to be able to know, okay, now you're in a really deep meditation. And not only that, to be able to use neurofeedback to help people stay in that deep meditation. So I think that's really exciting work.
Well, I just finished interviewing Eben Alexander, and he likes to meditate an hour or two every day. That's using binaural beats, which he believes help facilitate a state that enables him to not exactly return back to his near-death experience, but to approach it.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So he's very big on the use of binaural beats. Of course, his partner Karen has a company that promotes that.
Okay, I didn't know that. Yes, we've just started a collaboration with the Monroe Institute, which they, of course, use layered binaural beats for their sound technology.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my first studies and research was actually on binaural beats. That's how I kind of made my way into clinical research. And that was actually corporate sponsored by Holosync, which is a different company that does binaural beats.
Have you ever seen these?
No.
This is a replica of a pre-Columbian Peruvian whistling pot.
Oh, wow.
And I'm pretty sure the pre-Columbian Indians used these to create binaural beats.
Wow.
They create pure whistle tones. And if you have I have a set like of 7 of these, and they are each slightly different tones. So if you have different people blowing on them, and they're very nice, pure tones, they create binaural beats.
Right. It would create that beat frequency.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yes, I really do think that sound technologies is a ripe and, very high potential modality to use to help people get into those transcendent states.
Mhm.
And of course, psychedelics are getting really big now, but sound doesn't have as many of the adverse side effects and aren't as scary for people, I think, to envision listening to, music or sound than having a trip.
There's also the use of lights now. I've seen they have these devices. They actually put little night lights into your nostrils
Okay.
to activate the brain.
Yeah, that makes sense because both sound and light are supposed to create entrainment
Mhm.
of the brain waves. And I'm not thoroughly convinced of that yet because there haven't been like the fundamental studies to show that. I mean, there have been a few, but it hasn't been replicated for many different beat frequencies.
Mhm.
And but regardless, people are having experiences when they do have that strobing light or the beat frequency with the sound.
Mhm.
So it's definitely worth exploring.
I think all of that helps, but if the research or if the theory of the brain as a filter is correct, you would think the less brain activity, the better.
Right. That's right. And we see that, with the EEG studies on psilocybin.
Yeah.
They're expecting, because everyone's seeing all these colors and everything's so vivid, but the brain is just quiet. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think that that's very important, so that to the extent that the binaural beats don't quiet the brain, that they could actually be interfering.
Right. Because, what people may not understand is that depending on what frequency, so the way it's created is this is beating at a certain frequency, this has a certain frequency, and when they combine, it's the difference of the two. So you could have 100 hertz on one side and 110 on the other, and that gives you a beat frequency of 10. Or you could have 20 and 30. So is there a difference if the kind of carrier frequency is at 100 versus 20? These are all answers we don't quite know yet.
Right.
And so even though you're ending up with that same beat frequency of 10, which is in the alpha band,
Mm-hmm.
it may, have a different effect because that the carrier is higher. So there's research always just excites me because there's no end to the research questions that we can ask and attempt to find answers to.
Well, my friend Dan Statt, who was the one who made those replica Peruvian whistling pots, did a lot of research on the original ones. He began collecting them because there were different isolated tribes in Peru that lived in these little valleys. And they all had unique frequencies. They all made these same whistling pots, but they used different frequencies for each particular tribe.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Maybe the shaman or medicine person was like, hey, this is the way to do it, like we do now. Everyone has their own special way that they're convinced is the way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty funny.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm of the mind that there are many, many, many different ways to get to that transcendent states, and everyone gets to pick which one resonates best for them.
Yeah, that's sort of the approach behind Jeffrey Martin's Finders course, that he offers people all of these techniques and then says, find the one that works best for you.
That's great.
And apparently gets very good results that way.
Okay, I hadn't heard about that one.
Oh, I've done
You
several.
mean Jeffrey Martin at CIHS?
That's the person. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He used to be at
Okay.
Sophia. university, but at the same person, he has this big course. Well, we're about to start. It's the top of the hour now, and so I will stop sharing, and we are live. Welcome, everybody. This is Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm with Helané Wahbeh, who is the current president of the Parapsychological Association. She is also the research director at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Welcome, Helané.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you today.
I know it's been a couple of years since you were last on New Thinking Aloud, and your work has progressed a good deal. We had a fascinating conversation back then about your interest in channeling, which you defined in a very broad way. But let's spend a few minutes before we take questions from our viewers, giving our current viewers an update on what you've been doing lately.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's so much that has been happening in the ions world and the science of channeling world. I did actually take the research that we learned from the ions channeling research program and turned it into a book. So that book, The Science of Channeling, was released last September, and it's meant for the general public in a very accessible way to share about how common channeling is, who can do it, what do we know about it, how do we think it works. And I use a very, very broad definition of channeling, which includes everything that people might think of as psi. And that is also ions focus, ions research focus. So right now we have over 20 projects that are in various stages of development. And I wanted to share with you about a few of them that I think your audience would be interested in. All of this information is on our website at noetic.org. So you can go there to get more into the details about how to learn more, or even participate. So the first study that is ongoing right now is called The Genetics of Telephone Telepathy. And this is based on Rupert Sheldrake's telephone telepathy protocol. So we are basically attempting to replicate that with a little twist, because we're inviting triads of related people to participate in the telephone telepathy experiment, so that we can see if relatedness has anything to do with how well people do on that experiment. So basically, you receive a phone call. Many people have had this experience. A phone call comes in, you aren't looking at the caller ID, and you're like, oh, I know that's mom, or oh, that's so-and-so. So it's basically an experiment, seeing how accurate people are at telephone telepathy, and also how things like genetic, emotional closeness, and distance have to do with it. So that's at teletelly.org. Please check that out. We're recruiting actively right now, and we would love you to participate. The next study I wanted to share about is on the noetic signature. So this is a concept I introduced in the Science of Channeling book. And it's basically about each person's individual expression of their channeling abilities, and that we all have the capacity to channel, but it just looks different for every person. So we have gone through a series of studies to validate what we're calling the noetic signature inventory. It's 44 items. Last week, I just got news that the paper was accepted in the Frontiers of Psychology. So I'm really excited about that. And you can go to a link to take the inventory. And what you end up with is a report that shows you where you lie on 12 different characteristics that are common to everyone in terms of their channeling abilities. And I'm going to send that link to Jeff so that he can put it on the YouTube site. So anybody who wants to can go take this, help us with our research, and get a report to learn more about themselves.
Yeah, we will put all of the links into the description that will accompany this video. After we finish our live stream, the archival video will be online with a description attached to it, and every link for every study and book will be there.
Great, thank you. So those are two studies that we're working on right now that are actively recruiting participants. So that's something that you can support us in and learn more about. There's two other projects that I think you might find interesting. One is on medical intuition. So we did a number of studies looking at energy medicine and if clairvoyant seers could perceive the shifts in the energy during the sessions. And we had one seer in our first study that had over 200 people. We had 6 seers in our second study, and that was with 40 participants. And that one was specifically looking at the corroboration across the 6 seers to see if they were seeing the same things. And we found that, in fact, they were. We also found that they were essentially getting a fire hydrant of information. If we were not very specific about the layers that we wanted them to look at, they would get past life information, current life, physical, emotional, mental, etc. So we are planning a study now that's going to be more physically focused. So these are medical intuitives that are trained to intuit what's going on in the physical body. And we are also including their usefulness to medical professionals. So could the medical intuitive be a tool that supports physicians, say, with tough cases to try to figure out what's going on? That's another fascinating study. And then finally, we received some generous funding recently from the Marco Morelli Foundation to revive physical mediumship research. So we are hosting an invite-only symposium at the end of May to go through the state of the science on physical mediumship and develop a research program structure to infuse modern day physical mediumship research with some energy and hopefully be able to coordinate different researchers who are interested in this, raise funding to continue it, and to move some of that research on physical mediumship, ectoplasm, trumpet horns, materialization. I called it the other day to someone, the fringe of the fringe of the fringe in parapsychology research. So I like dabbling on those edges, Jeff, and I'm excited to support that work becoming more mainstream.
I think that's wonderful because, to my knowledge, the last serious study of physical mediumship was the Skoll experiments, and that was well over 20 years ago.
That's right. So we're looking forward to reviving that. And, we all know Robin Foy just passed, and I'm not sure what's happening with that group now. I know that they had moved to Spain and wanted to set up a center there. So we're going to give them some space because of Robin's passing, but we definitely want to connect with them and collaborate with them about that.
Yes, to my knowledge, they're still active. And actually, I'm pretty sure that they were doing some sort of a live stream themselves today.
Okay.
Their work in physical mediumship. Because of the time difference, I think I would have had to be up at 5 a.m. to
Right.
to catch it, but I know they plan to continue.
That's wonderful. Yes, we look forward to connecting with them. So
Oh,
that's a little taste. Those 4 projects are a little taste of the work that we're doing at IONS. We have a multidisciplinary team that works together to move these projects forward. We also have a experience department that offers direct experiences for people around these topics. So if you aren't familiar with IONS, I invite you to check us out, get connected with the community, and continue this exploration.
and for people who are unfamiliar, they may not appreciate ION stands
Okay,
for
yes,
Institute of Noetic Sciences.
that's right. Thank you. Yes.
And once again, that's noetics.org is the website. Okay, well, we have some questions coming in from our viewers. We have a team of moderators who are fielding the questions. The first question is from one of our moderators, Emmy Vadnais, who asks, how is channeling different from our own internal thought process?
That's a great question. I would describe most of our day-to-day thinking to be related to our personal ego self, our personality. Now, many people in spiritual traditions talk about getting rid of the ego. I'm not a proponent of that. I'm a proponent of expanding our ego, our personality, because we really do need it to function on a day-to-day basis in our daily life. So what I envision channeling being different from that is that it is tapping into something bigger, something broader, more expansive than our ego, personality, self, our smaller personal self, if you will. Now, can channeling still use our cognitive capacity? Yes, because we have the brain. Many people talk about the brain being the tool through which this information comes through. And I am pretty supportive of that idea as well. So the simplest way I think to say it is that our normal thinking is our personal, smaller ego self, and channeling taps into a bigger, larger, more expansive self.
I have a whole series of questions from a viewer whose YouTube name is Kev the Rev. And I think it means reverend. And so Kev asks, first of all, about serious research into the phenomenon of channeling. How much of this research ever gets published, for example, in mainstream scientific journals?
That's a great question. Well, our most recent paper on trance channeling was just published in F1000 Research, which is a mainstream open access journal. There is a group, and I'm assuming for some reason that Kev the Rev is thinking of trance channeling, but maybe he's not. I'll speak to trance channeling first. There's also a group in Brazil that does quite a bit of research on trance channeling, and they have a number of psychiatrists on their team. And so they often get published in psychiatry journals, mainstream psychiatry journals. So I think that this work it's not like completely fringe journals that trance channeling gets into. Often we have to give it the slant as a pathology to get it in, but then, can talk about it in a positive light. In terms of other aspects of channeling, precognition, presentiment, those have been in pretty mainstream journals as well. So every once in a while we get one that slide in. There have been some in the 70s and 80s that were in like the Journal of American Medical Association. There was one on near-death experiences that I believe ended up in JAMA. So it happens occasionally.
Now, you mentioned near-death experiences. So I need to ask, is there a relationship that you see between the near-death experience and channeling?
Great question. Is a near-death experience channeling? I would say no. Are they related? I think they are, because it speaks to this concept that our consciousness is not limited to our physical body, and that it can go beyond that, whether it's into, heavenly realms or different dimensions or whatever near-death experiencers are experiencing, or connecting to non-physical beings who are on a different dimension, or tapping into information that's not perceived by our traditional five senses. I see that as all as related somehow.
Well, Kev the Rev does have a related question. He's asking about demonic possession, and would you consider that a kind of involuntary form of channeling?
Yes, that's also a great question, because, people often ask me, about the negative aspects of channeling and trance channeling. From what I have read and learned about, and I'm definitely not an expert on demonic possession or negative possession, is that it can happen, but that it is more rare. Whether demons are real or not, I don't know if I really ascribe to that. My experience is that people can be channeling entities that are not, I don't want to say not, they are of a heavier density, if you will, or perhaps may not have positive intentions in mind, and that this, yes, can happen, but I really don't want people to be fearful about it, because it is exceedingly rare when it happens kind of in this negative way. So will you read Kevin's question again? Because I think I got off on a tangent.
No, you were answering it, I think, very directly. It simply was demonic possession a kind of involuntary channeling?
Yes, I think that does and can happen, and it is rare. And I want to just give a caveat here, because I don't like always using the word apparent non-physical being, or purported, or supposed, and this term proven, that these things are proven. From a scientific perspective, we really don't know. We don't know what the source of channeling is. And yet, personally, my personal experience is such that I do believe that these non-physical beings exist, and I have yet to prove it in a way that I could demonstrate through the scientific method. So that's my filter, if you will, as I'm sharing this information with you.
Kev the Rev has asked yet another question, and I'm going to, normally I jump around more from person to person, but these all seem to be follow-up questions related to what you're saying. And so he says, a poet or an artist, are they channeling an external, discrete source, or is it simply their own inner talent that they're channeling?
I would say it could be both, and it's really a case-by-case basis. I think some artists, musicians are channeling what you might call an external source, and that brings up, and sometimes they aren't. And It really depends on the person and the situation. Now, this also brings up another great point, which is what is internal and what is external, what is part of me and what is outside of me. So we're living in this, physical body. We have the perception that we're actually separate from other things around us. And yet there's more and more evidence showing us that we're actually all interconnected, that at some layer of reality, I am the external being and it is me. I am Jeff, Jeff is me, etc. And so it really is the point of view of the answerer, what the answer to that question is. So when you say, is it external? I'd say, no, it's not external, because we're all part of the same thing and they're receiving it from an aspect of themselves. If I look at it from another perspective, then I say, yes, it's their spiritual guide that's inspiring them, that's giving them information, or it's part of their higher self or part of their unconscious that it's buried. So I'll stop there.
Oh, okay. Well, you've raised, the core issue of mysticism as a whole. If all is one, then the very notion of external entities becomes secondary at best.
Yes, there's a beautiful metaphor that came through during one of our trance channeling studies that I really love, that just resonates with me. The question that we asked was, how can we be all one and yet separate? And they said, envision the electromagnetic spectrum. When you think of that, you could think of it as one thing. It's this one spectrum. And yet it is made up of all these separate individual frequencies that you can take down to multiple decimal points. And each one of those frequencies has specific characteristics, specific expressions. And so I really loved that metaphor for thinking about this dual nature of oneness of all versus Helané has very specific characteristics about her that is very different from Jeff and very different from Kevin. And so we can still be these separate individual characteristics beings, and yet we can still be part of this larger spectrum.
Here's a question from Laura Newbert, who is also one of our volunteers. She asks, what role do feelings play in the intuitive process?
That's a wonderful question as well. I think that, again, there's nuances to that. I'll give a personal example. So if I'm really attached and emotional about a specific issue, when I sit down to channel and get a clear answer on it, I can't. I'm like completely, my emotions have clouded my grounded, clear guidance. So, and yet when I think of the higher aspects of the heart, when the heart is developed and open and in this loving, kind, altruistic, compassionate state, that can really support and nurture being able to bring in wisdom. And so maybe it goes back to one of the first questions about, are those emotions biologically fight or flight generated from our either physical body or ego self? Or are they sort of higher emotions that can allow us to transcend that fight or flight reaction of the nervous system?
Very good point. And here's a question from somebody whose YouTube name is Mr. Black. It says, are there theories about how the information travels from, he's using the phrase, the other side, think he means the non-physical realm, to the channeler.
There's so much there. I'm just thinking about how I want to start. So I'll begin very broadly, which is with the idea of entanglement, and that, you know, in quantum physics, we have, they've demonstrated in multiple experiments, multiple labs, in various sized objects, from photons to small diamonds, that we can entangle objects such that we can take one and take the, we can entangle a pair and take one to the other side of the world. And when one is moved, the other is moved. So if you envision that we are entangled in some way, physically and non-physically, so these non-physical beings are entangled with us as physical beings, then perhaps that supports the communication in some way. This is all speculation. The short answer is, I don't know, actually. So that's the shortest answer to your question. There are some other theories about the structure of the brain and perhaps how it acts as a receiver. Some people believe that the pineal gland, which is one of the only structures in the body that is sensitive to light, plays some part in receiving information and communicating that. Again, that has not been shown, but that's definitely a theory. There's also a theory around the brain as a filter. So if you envision that we could have access to all the information in the universe at one time, that would just completely blow us up. Like, we couldn't handle taking all of that in. And so the idea is that the brains actually acts as a guard or a gate or a filter to only allow certain information in, so that we don't get overwhelmed. And there's actually, you know, some evidence supporting this with the various studies in psychedelics and various pathologies where that filter's not working quite right, and people have more psi experiences. So I kind of jumped all over the place around that, but I think I'll stop there and see if there's any other questions or comments.
Yeah, it seems to me, in response to that question, that ultimately human consciousness itself extends well beyond what we think of as this four-dimensional space-time reality. So it may not be a question of information traveling from there to here. It may be more a question of space and time not being what we conventionally think they are.
Yes, thank you for talking about the question again, because I just completely skipped over that part. Because just to clearly say, it's likely not a force. I mean, we are seeing this over and over and over again in all the various psi experiences that we've observed, is that it's not a force, because it doesn't take time for the information to go from point A to point B, say in the remote viewing studies or telepathy studies or the distant mental interaction of living system studies. It happens instantaneously. So if the information was traveling, it would take time, but it doesn't take time. It happens instantaneously. So thanks for bringing that up again.
And here's a question from an individual whose YouTube name is Abuleant Nucleus, who says, while much of your research seems to concern physiological and evidential characteristics of channeling, what about qualitative study of the channeled content?
this person's feeding me the perfect questions, right? So one whole aspect of the science of channeling, the IONS channeling research program is just that, to look at content. And we are working on a manuscript right now on a really unique project where we asked multiple channelers 10 specific science questions. We asked a bunch of scientists, hey, if you could get an answer through channelers about a science question, what would it be? We distilled those down, we asked all those questions, and we got volumes of information. This is a collaboration with Patricio Tresoldi in Italy. And they did it for Italian channelers, and we did it here in the US with US channelers, and worked on a qualitative analysis, and we're now writing that paper up. Now, qualitative research takes much, much longer because you have to read the information, you have to synthesize it, you have to pull out themes. So often people stay away from it because it's just more work, and it takes a lot more time. We are committed to doing it. And so that's an example of one project. John Klimo wrote a book, I believe it was just called Channeling, and he has a lot of information in there about the various content. And one of my dream projects is to actually collect trans-channeled information from around the world. I would have a huge team, I'd have an unlimited budget, and we would do this incredible synthetic analysis to look at comparisons across the various channels from around the world to see what are the same themes. That being said, we already see common themes in the content. Number one, we're more than we think we are. We are all connected. We are all love. Humanity is awakening. How can we support that awakening? And empowering each of us as individuals and as, and humanity as a whole to become more loving, more compassionate, more kind, and step into the fullness of who we are. Those are just, basic themes that we see across the board in all of these channelers without the sophisticated qualitative analysis.
As I recall, one of the most fascinating examples regarding the content of channeled material came from Brazil, from two mediums, Chico Xavier and Waldo Vieira, where they were in different cities, I think well over 100 miles apart. They were not in communication with each other, but apparently they were channeling the same entity, who decided to write a book, and that each of them would write an alternative chapter. So it was only after all the chapters were written that the book was put together, and it was, according to Guy Lyon Playfair, who wrote a review, the chapters fit together really precisely, suggesting, the autonomous existence of the communicator.
That's incredible. That's a wonderful, wonderful example. And, if you think of content as art as well, there's, the Brazilian Luis Gasparado, who would produce these extraordinary pieces of art, often with both hands and in minutes. It's incredible to think about what has come through various channeling experiences.
And music as well, I understand.
Yes.
Well, Ebullient Nucleus has a follow-up question, and he or she writes, channelers like Jane Roberts, Helen Schuckman, Ramon Stevens, and other well-known authors were ordinary people, but they produced material of vast scope and sophistication. And the question is, isn't this veridical?
If you mean veridical in the sense that, the idea that they produced something that was beyond their normal capacity, yes, I think that does support the notion that we're tapping into something greater than ourselves. Now, other people might say that's not veridical enough because perhaps that information was buried in their unconscious and they were just pulling it out. And yet I see evidence as a tapestry, if you will, and that we have numerous examples of channelers who have a education, skill, etc. set that does not match the information that's coming through. I mean, I have that in my own family. My uncle, was barely a high school graduate and was channeling all this incredible information. My grandmother would channel in different languages, and we have cases of this from around the world as well. So yes, I do think those lend support to the veracity of this.
And here is a question from Attic42, who is asking you about your own personal experiences. I know we touched on this in our previous interview, but not all of our viewers have watched that. So would you mind talking a little bit about your personal experience with channeling?
Sure. So my mother's side of the family is full of channelers of different types. And I was very sensitive as a child growing up to emotions. I would, feel like there was things in the room with me and I wouldn't know what it was. And when I was 10 years old, my mom initiated me into a spiritualist-like meeting at my grandparents' house. And my grandmother was a trance channel, my uncle's a trance channeler, and they would have these meetings where people would sit in a circle and ask them questions. And that was my initiation into that world, and was raised with, this deep love and connection to the spirit world, and with the understanding that I had spiritual guides who could support me. And if I connected to them, that they would help guide me in my choices. They would protect me, and that there was a whole invisible world that was in parallel to ours that had our highest and best interest in mind. So that was a belief system that I was raised in. Now, growing up and into my adult years, my channeling took the form of, or I guess you could call my noetic signature, was that I really felt things in my body. I would get goosebumps if things were true. I would get downloads of information about people that I wouldn't normally know. I never heard like clear sentences or words from my guides. It was very visceral to me, and that's my kind of noetic signature, if you will. And I had started a meditation practice in my 20s and continue that to this day. And that really supported me to strengthen my channeling. I was a personal growth nut and took many, many different types of personal growth workshops, and then met my spiritual community of Core Light. And there are a number of tools that I learned to help clear the layers of the ego, which also helps strengthen the clear channeling signal, if you will. And, use that to support me in my life. More recently, I learned about, since when I got to ions and I was doing these trance channeling studies, I learned that about a hypnosis technique to learn how to trance channel, because even though that was in my family, I'd never tried it before. And again, this was from Patricio Trusoldi's group in Italy. I said, this would be a really incredible opportunity for me to learn how to trance channel. So I went through the 6 sessions, hypnosis. I found a hypnotherapist. I went through the sessions. You first learn how to do an out-of-body experience, which I was able to do. And then you with positive intention and all these, pieces in place, invite in a non-physical being to speak through, and it worked. And I can now trance channel. So that is the most bizarre experience I've ever had in my life, to be a witness to communication coming out of my mouth that I have no idea what is going to come out next, and has supported me in personally believing the veracity of this, and also informing how to be able to study it in a way to support people. And I'll be honest, I'm kind of over trying to prove that it's true, because people will just butt heads and argue about that forever, because you can take all these, arguments from either side. And so I'm much more interested in saying, okay, we can't really know definitively with the tools we have today from the scientific perspective. Let's just set that aside until we do, and explore it in all these other ways. What are the characteristics? How can we use it? What about the content? Can it support us? Can it help us make better decisions, be better people, get information to support all these issues we have in our world today, if we could find solutions for those? I'm much more interested in putting my time and energy into that.
You mentioned just in passing that you had an out-of-body experience in a training program you went through. I was about to ask you a related question from Crystal A, who wanted to know if you've ever done any research in bilocation. So could you talk about your out-of-body experience and how it might possibly relate to the issue of bilocation?
I have had an out-of-body experience. At first, I wasn't sure, because it wasn't the traditional, you step out, you turn around, you see your body laying there. It felt like I hadn't completely abandoned my physical body, but that my consciousness was out of it, exploring other places. And this was through the hypnosis protocol, and I set up some tests. So I asked various team members to place things on high locations that they couldn't access. And in each one of the sessions, I would go see what they were and then come and report back to them. This was a case of one, and we haven't written this up. This is just Helané exploring, but I was impressed with myself by being able to see those objects and describe them in some way. Like one was a soccer ball, and I said, it's a ball, it has 2 colors, blah, blah, blah. There was a teddy bear, which I described really well. There were a number of things that I felt I described pretty well compared to my own sense of what chance would have been like. All that work happened before COVID, and we have not been doing in-person studies, so we haven't been able to test that protocol out on other people. I would love to do it again. In terms of out of body, I just saw a talk by Graham Nichols on the Society for Psychical Research about out of body experience research, and his talk was very reaffirming to me, because he was sharing that this whole perspective of popping out and looking at your body is actually not the most common experience. And so this, my experience of this just consciousness moving around is actually quite common. I've personally not done any out-of-body experience research beyond that. Graham Nichols is obviously a great resource to look into. Similarly, I've only briefly read about bilocation, and we have not done any research on that. It's a fascinating phenomenon, and it would be incredible if we could find someone who could do that on demand. That would be the simplest way to be able to study it. But my understanding is it's mostly spontaneous. But if you know anyone who can do that, please let us know.
Well, as a matter of fact, there is a questioner here who seems to be hinting at exactly that. And now I'm going to change. Here we go. Eli Bellish says, if two individuals capable of channeling an 100% success rate would have come forward, would that help progress the research?
In terms of bilocation, absolutely. Yes. So, and people also who can do out-of-body experiences on demand, that's really helpful. We have this study design where we haven't done this yet, but we have definitely been talking about it in the past, where there's a computer screen that is actually cycling through images, because there's this one, people always say, oh, it's just telepathy. They're reading the mind of the researcher. And so how do we get around that? Well, if the researcher doesn't know what the object or the image is that the out-of-body person is perceiving, it's just the computer that knows, then that kind of removes that a little bit.
Here is a question from Elena Campbell, who wonders if there's a relationship between the pineal gland calcification and vagus nerve activity levels.
There could be. I mean, the whole autonomic nervous system, I guess maybe what she's alluding to is if you don't use it, you lose it, or if you're stuck in fight or flight. So the vagus nerve is a major player in our autonomic nervous system and really supports being in that parasympathetic, which is the rest and relax, which is conducive to channeling or psi experiences in general. And that perhaps if you're stuck in fight or flight, then you're diminishing your, there's so many assumptions built into what I'm saying, but like you're stuck in fight or flight, that's not nourishing your pineal gland, which is what is allows you to tap in. And so then it calcifies. That's complete conjecture, but could be a theory for what the connection that you're talking about. Can I say one more thing about that?
Of course. Because
I mentioned in general, parasympathetic rest and relax is much more conducive to psi experiences. However, there are many, many cases that we see when people are in life or death or very stressful or about to get into a car accident, protection type messages that come through. Stop, don't turn right. And, all these stories of people being prevented from being in danger or being harmed. And that is not a parasympathetic situation where you're driving the car and about to get into a car crash. So that's one exception to what I just shared earlier.
That's very interesting, because I remember the classic book by Andrea Puharich, Beyond Telepathy, from many years ago, in which he thought the aroused physiological state is good for telepathic sending, but not receiving.
Oh, interesting. That's fascinating. Yeah. Yes. And we see this dichotomy in trance channeling physiology studies too, because Stanley Krippner and Ian, I'm not going to be able to say his last name right, Wickramasera, found a stimulation of the nervous system in trance channeling, whereas others have found a parasympathetic activation. So I feel like we often look for the one simple answer, and yet what we find are just nuance after nuance after nuance, and that it's so individualized. So I would love to have blanket answers that are true across the board, but it usually isn't the case.
Well, it's probably likely that there are almost as many different styles of channeling as there are people.
Right.
And here's a related question from Tantlian1, whom I believe is another one of our volunteers, Elizabeth Lord, who asks, do the practitioners of channeling ever remember what information passed through them?
So in general, they usually don't. So there is a spectrum of trance. In the older times, trance channelers would say that it was like they fell asleep, and they would have no recollection of what happened during the session. And there's still a few today who do that, but more usually nowadays, trance channelers are not in a complete trance state. It's like they describe it as stepping aside and observing, and there's some observation of this session, and so they can hear everything that's being said. But if you ask them an hour later, do you remember this piece? And it's completely fuzzy. And this happens to me too, actually. So I've experienced this firsthand. Somehow we can witness it, but the memory of it doesn't stick unless it's recorded, or I hear the recording and then I'll recognize it. But there's a different encoding, if you will, of the memory.
Here's a fascinating question from an individual whose internet name is Dark Night of the Soul, K-N-I-G-H-T, Dark Night of the Soul. May there be a connection between experiencing synchronicities and channeling?
I personally believe that there is, because if you imagine that you are opening to information, energy, etc., from beyond yourself, then my thought is that would allow you to be more open to opportunities that show up. Also, we have one question of this in our IONS Discovery Lab survey. So we've asked about synchronicity in thousands and thousands of people, and we're looking forward to actually looking at that data and seeing if there is a relationship. But if you envision that channeling is being more connected to our interconnectedness, then of course synchronicities would arise.
And here's a similar question from Chris Scarpantonio, who is wondering about abduction experiences, alien abduction, and if that has any relationship to channeling or sensitivity to reception of information or psychic abilities in general.
I will acknowledge that I don't know a whole lot about that field. I am obviously learned a little bit about it just through this work. And do people who are more sensitive get more abducted? I don't know. Do people who are more sensitive believe that they are receiving communications and channeling extraterrestrial intelligences? Yes. That is definitely true. I'm not so familiar with the abduction literature specifically, but extraterrestrial intelligences are believed to be a major source of many trance channelers' information. And what else do I want to say about that? for the most part, all the content that I have heard recently about that is that we are not alone, that there are ETIs or extraterrestrial intelligences, that there are a number of them who are striving to support humanity to evolve and awaken and not destroy ourselves. And so it is in the best interest of humanity, but also the civilizations throughout the universe, that we don't blow ourselves up and that we evolve into a more peaceful planet without war, and that they are doing this for the most part undercover, if you will. But if you put this into Google, I mean, I don't know how many hits people are believe that this is actually really happening, have had communications, and hold this notion that we're not alone and we are being supported.
I have a question here from John Alexander, who has been a guest on New Thinking Aloud. And he's asking about the difference between trans-channeling of information versus physical possession. And he has described an example when he was in Brazil with his wife, Victoria, attending a spiritist ritual where Victoria actually became physically possessed.
Yeah, it's intense. So here's what I've learned, and that channeling, even so, we're talking about trans channeling now. So trans channeling, we had a focus group around that where we had 5 trans channelers, and we were asking multiple questions to these different 5 trans channelers. And my overall goal was to find out, how does trans channeling work? And I wanted them to say, it works like this. Here is the one way that trans channeling works. And of course, that wasn't the case. They said there's multiple different ways that trans channeling can work. And so one way is just to come through and use the faculty of the mind, of the brain, the library of the trans channeler's mind, and the vocal aspects to speak, right? So you can think of it as the non-physical being just coming in up to the neck and not using the whole body. Then the being can also take over the whole entire body through they described it as like a enmeshment, if you will, of the energy of the trans channeler and the energy of the being become enmeshed, and they're able to sync up, and then the being can use the body. Then there was another way that was essentially, I mean, it sounds so demeaning, but it was like a puppet. If the being is so strong, so that they don't even need to enmesh, enmeshment.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That that they would use the body like a puppet, that they wouldn't need to enmesh, that they could just physically move the body around. And so what creates that, which one it's going to be, is the channeler themselves, their energetics, their characteristics, their development, and the source and their energetic, their frequency, power, etc. Now, so that's what I've learned from my readings, from my research, from my studies. Personally, I've also had this experience where, when I first was learning, a being came in that was, kind of more in my body, and it felt so overwhelming to me. I felt almost like panicky and didn't like it. And I was like, this doesn't feel good to me. And so I said, all right, guides, if I'm going to do this again, I don't want it to fill my whole body. Just come up to here. And that was honored. And so I haven't had any of those full body kind of overwhelming experiences anymore. I hope that's helpful, John.
That was very helpful, I thought, Helané. And here's another question related from a person whose internet name or YouTube name is simply Jay. And Jay is asking, do you protect yourself in a spiritual, metaphysical sense while channeling? I might also mention, since we're near the top of the hour, that we'll be continuing for another half hour.
Thank you. I personally do. I personally like using protection intentions and rituals, not because I fear that I am necessarily in danger per se, but that it is part of my creating a safe space for me personally. There are many, many traditions around the world that have protection, spiritual protection rituals, spiritual protection guides. And, people say, well, what are you protecting against? That infers that there's this evil, beings that are going to come try to attack me or something. So that's not, I'm not worried about that. I don't feel like there's a danger to that. That being said, my nervous system is quite sensitive. And so for me, part of the protection is creating a safe layer of energetic, I call it my bubble of happiness. It's essentially a bubble that supports my nervous system to stay clear, intact, and not overwhelmed. So if you envision, if I completely take my filters down and I get blasted, it can affect my nervous system in a negative way because I still do live in this body. So part of it is this, physical protection of my nervous system. Part of it is, I'm going to get really esoteric here, Jeff, is this, there's this concept of earthbound spirits, and that some beings, when they pass, for multiple reasons, do not actually go to the light or move on or whatever you want to call it. And they get attracted when you do this spiritual work. Again, there's not a malicious intent, if you will, but they are energetically dense, and their density can affect me, can affect channelers. And so that's another layer of protection. And we could have a whole nother conversation about earthbound spirits and psychopathology and potential relationships with that. So I hope I answered that question. The take-home message is, yes, I do use those. Yes, I actually also recommend them, not for any fearful reason, but because it is a good practice to maintain our integrity and clarity and wholeness.
Thank you for that. And here is a question from Verda Filosofo, who asks, what is a common or reliable method for channeling?
I think that's beyond the scope of this one session here, but I will say in my book, shameless plug to get my book, and I have a whole chapter on various steps to take to nurture and support your channeling ability. One of the first things I say in that chapter is that there's no one right way, and that what I offer are common guidelines that many spiritual teachers and traditions may support. Another recommendation is to set an intention for a teacher or community to show up for you that will support you in that, because many people like to do this in the context of a community to feel supported, to be able to ask these questions and feel guided on their path and process, and to trust that the next best step will show up for you.
And I have a comment here from our moderators they're concerned that some people amongst our viewers are getting a little spooked out by the idea of that you need protection, that out there in the super sensible realm, there can be entities that may pester people in different ways. And they've recommended that I remind our viewers and listeners that if they search through the listings on the New Thinking Aloud channel, there's an interview with Terence Palmer on psychic self-defense. And he even links to an exercise he created on psychic self-defense. Terry Palmer died just last year, right around New Year's. And he is the author of a book, The Science of Spiritual Possession. So it was very informative material. I want to make sure the viewers are aware that if they're feeling a little nervous about what we're describing here, there are resources available.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was my exact point. It's not to be fearful that there's these evil beings, out to get you per se. I guess you can think of it like pollution, if you will. So if you were, going out into a heavy, polluted area, you would take measures to protect yourself. Or if you're going out into the rain, you would bring an umbrella. So, maybe these are trite examples, but it's not that there's specific malicious intent always out to get you. It's about, using tools to support yourself to stay clear.
Now, this is sort of an offbeat question, but I think it's fascinating, from Jay Shope, who says he's heard of accounts of apports. Often they're positive, like gold coins and pretty jewelry and things, but he's wondering in the world of apports if there are nasty things, toxic things that ever get apported. Personally, I'm not aware of that, but I don't know if you've studied apports, but do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, all the cases that I've heard about have not been negative, like the questioner mentioned, coins and various objects. I've not personally done those studies, but as part of that physical mediumship symposium that we're talking about, that's one of the major categories. And if the listeners know anybody that can produce apports, please send them our way.
Good. That would be a very useful thing to continue research in that unusual area. And of course, it would be related to your interest in physical mediumship in general. Sergio Lapro is asking, is there any indication that one channeler could shut down the channeling of another channeler, sort of an anti-phase effect is how Sergio describes it?
That's a fascinating question. I don't think so, because historically you hear about mediums and channelers have a spirit guide control. And that's my understanding now with most trance channelers. And they, if by some slim chance another channeler intentfully tried to do that it would be blocked in some way. Also, maybe you're asking not from a malicious intent, but just from being near each other. I've been in rooms with many different channelers channeling at the same time, and it was never an issue. One of my most fascinating trance channeling experiences was at that focus group in Mount Shasta, and that work is published, so you can learn more about it, where the 5 trance channelers were all channeling different non-physical beings and having a conversation with each other. So those non-physical beings were having a conversation through the channelers. It was quite profound. I
have a series of questions from Ron Thomas, who, and when actually a few other people, they're all asking along the same lines. Is a fish aware of water? Are we aware of what we are? Another person asks, are mushrooms aware of the mycelium? And another one says, are we aware of ourselves? I think the point of all of these questions is that potentially there's so much about ourselves that is unconscious that we're not even aware of. And how does that fit into the world of channeling?
Well, I think it goes back to the whole piece around consciousness and, what is our consciousness? What is our specific slice of our consciousness? And, many people suppose that everything has consciousness. So if I'm doing an internal process and I go into, let's say, my heart organ, and I go into my heart cells and I connect with them, that heart cell could be said to have a consciousness that I am them connecting with. And, one thing we haven't talked a lot about is this whole thing of intention and being able to, through our consciousness, create clear, directed intention to, let's say, heal, to, if I'm having an issue with my heart, I can send my consciousness into my heart, connect with my heart cells, offer them love and kindness, a positive intention to support them and heal. And so I think the other piece they were alluding to is we don't know what we don't know, this whole aspect of unconscious, being unconscious of it all. And I think part of it is, again, we could be blown away if we actually knew everything we could know, right? And so how do we just take these small little steps to awaken to the truth of the nature of our reality in a way that doesn't blast us out of the waters? And, that brings back to the psychedelics again, which I'm absolutely not opposed to. And yet, when people don't do it in the right set and context, it can be harmful because it blasts them open. They aren't quite ready for it. They don't know how to integrate it. And then they can have negative side effects from that.
Yeah, bringing up psychedelics is sort of very relevant because many people, I've personally taken psychedelics over 100 times and had good experiences every time, and I'm grateful for them. But I know other people have had real trouble with psychedelics. And there's a question here from Luke Harmon, which is related. He asks, are there good reasons to communicate with entities? Luke goes on to say, on the one hand, I respect the explorers like Aleister Crowley. On the other hand, I see the wisdom of people like Manly P. Hall, who see things like channeling as unhelpful.
Yes, I agree to a certain extent. And the extent I agree to that is there is a trap to see it as a projection of our authority to something outside of ourselves. So people can use it as a fix, if you will. Oh, okay, I don't know something, so I have to check in. I have to keep checking in. I have to use this as a escape from my life. Living in a, disconnected way. I feel like I'm not describing this very well, but I see the dangers. And it's interesting because there's some spiritual traditions where, as people go more deeply into their meditative practice and spiritual practice, they start having psychic experiences or channeling experiences. And the teacher will say, don't worry about that. Like, stay focused on what you're doing. That's just a diversion, a distraction. And so I I really do hear that point. Now, I'm definitely a proponent of people channeling in their daily life, but not in a way that distracts, but in a way that expands and supports and nurtures what they're doing. In a very practical way, I find that people who learn how to channel for discernment in terms of decisions they're making in their life and the choices that they have to make on a day-to-day basis, that it dramatically improves their quality of life, their ease, improves their mood, improves their relationships. So that's the type of intuitive channeling that I'm really supportive of. And I absolutely acknowledge that there can be a tendency for some people to then go into it in a way that can be unhealthful.
I'm reminded of people who use the I Ching a lot. And since Aleister Crowley came up, I remember it was either Aleister Crowley or it might have been Timothy Leary, his writings about the I Ching. He felt at one point the I Ching was out to get him. And I think sometimes if people rely too frequently on these methods, particularly if they're being used as oracles for guidance, my own feeling is that you only need to go to the oracle very occasionally for advice. If you go too frequently, it can be unhelpful. It can become probably too much psychological projection.
Absolutely. And, you know, I guess the reminder is that everything we receive through channeling, I would want to invite the channeler to just remind themselves that that's all part of them. That's all within them. So there may be this perception of going outside of us or getting information from outside of us, but it's all still aspects of ourselves.
There have been a number of questions, Helané, about the different kinds of entities. Some people are asking about fairies, and other people are talking about the elementals. And another person has asked about if we're one with everything, does that mean we're one with the rocks? For example, can rocks talk to us? I wonder if you have any thoughts to this line of questioning.
Yes. So again, that Mount Shasta study, you know, there were 21 different entity types that supposedly came through, from elementals to angels to guides, ascended masters, extraterrestrial intelligences. And, you know, the main message was everything has consciousness. That consciousness is different. So the consciousness of a rock, there is a consciousness of a rock, but that consciousness is very different than my consciousness. And so I think there's many people on this planet who could say that they've communed with a rock in some way. If you sit in meditation near a rock, there is a sense of awareness that you can connect to.
I've got a fascinating series of questions here from Andrei Slavoj-Krasowski. And he's referring to a very well-known case in the literature, but all of our viewers may not be aware of it, the Korchnoi-Maraksi case, in which a deceased chess master came through a channeler, an automatic writer, and played a game of chess with a living chess master. And so Andre is asking about, are more experiments along those lines going on? For example, he wants to know, couldn't we get a deceased mathematician to come through, or other deceased experts who could share their expertise in ways that would demonstrate what's going on? And if you're aware of anything along those lines.
Yes, I love that case. And someone earlier asked about the verifiability, like, isn't it just, isn't that veridical when
Yeah.
the channeler is demonstrating a skill that they have no prior awareness of? And I agree. I think that is a wonderful veridical experiment to do, so much so that it was one of the 10 experiments that we included in our essay on evidence of survival for the Bigelow contest. So myself and Chief Scientist Dean Radin and Arno Delorme, scientists at IONS, wrote an essay, which obviously Jeff is very well aware of as the top prize winner. And we picked 10 experiments that we thought should be done to demonstrate survival of consciousness. And one of that is around skills. And as far as I know, there have not been any recent formal experiments of that, but I think it's one that could be easily implemented, and we're hoping to do that eventually.
And here's a follow-up question from Andrei Slavash Krasowski, who also is asking about channeling animals. And he's thinking of now Coco, the gorilla. I'm pretty sure Coco is deceased at this point, who communicated through sign language. Coco was a gorilla who learned sign language. And could somebody, if they could channel Coco, might be possible to verify her identity. And so Andre is wondering if anything like this has been going on.
That's wonderful. I was actually just talking to my mother about that yesterday, because I'm sure many of the listeners have very special animals in their lives that they feel probably will survive in some individuated way once they pass. And if so, could those animals come speak through a trance channeler? There's also, stories of enlightened beings taking on animal form to support the planet, like the white lions in South Africa, or some elephants, or, larger mammals of the waters. I have yet to see that. And if it happens, I'll definitely let you know, but I imagine it could.
Okay, and here's yet another follow-up question from Andrei Slavash Krasowski, who's asking about alpha asymmetry. I think he's referring to the two hemispheres of the brain, and whether the symmetry or asymmetry of the brain hemispheres has anything to do with the what he calls a psi conducive pattern.
Yes. We actually just did a paper on alpha asymmetry and well-being. I have not seen anything about alpha asymmetry and psi conduciveness. There is alpha and theta are associated with greater psi. And just to say that these are all correlates, right? Physiological correlates. And it's essentially our attempt to relate what is happening in the body to the phenomena we're experiencing. So does alpha asymmetry, let's say we had 10 studies with alpha asymmetry showing that was conducive to psi, does that mean that's what creates psi? Maybe, but maybe not. But it allows us to gain insight into perhaps the interface between our bodies and the psi phenomenon.
Here is a very technical question. I'm not sure I even understand it, but maybe you will. I think you will. From Michael Frank, who said, could the practice of focusing the eyes on the tip of the nose induce the oculocardiac reflex by exerting pressure on the vagus nerve, slowing the heart rate and helping to induce lucid dreaming?
Wow, there's so many concepts in there. I'm not sure about the eye movements. Perhaps that does trigger the ocular vagal response. We did talk about the vagus nerve already and how that does support the parasympathetic activation. Then you take the other jump into lucid dreaming, which is a whole nother realm. I do know that one of our noetic signature characteristics is dreams. So there's a specific set of people who have precognitive dreams, lucid dreams. That's their noetic signature expression. We haven't learned quite yet what allows people to receive more information from dreams versus other areas. But we also know that lucid dreaming can be taught, that you can learn specific tricks to support you to have a lucid dream. And I'm not aware in this moment of the relationship between that and the vagus stimulation. So that's what I know about that. Maybe there's more pieces I'm not aware of, but.
Well, that's a better answer than I could have.
One really fascinating thing, a little bit of an aside, but I think still interesting to your audience. We just finished a lucid dreaming study where there were people who had a post-traumatic stress disorder. And the goal was to have a healing lucid dream where they would set an intention, and within the dream, they would, if they see a monster, the monster would shift into something more healing, etc. And those participants not only had reductions in nightmares, but they also had an improvement in their post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. We're really excited about that study, and we're aiming to do a follow-up with it.
So it suggests that lucid dreaming might be, in your view, a form of channeling.
I guess I perceive it more as a healing modality, if you will, but it could be seen as a form if you explicitly use it to get information from beyond your personal self. So yes, I guess it could be perceived as channeling.
And here we've got a question. We're almost at the end of our time. We have just about 3 minutes left. And this is a tricky question. It refers to a part of the brain known as the caudate nucleus putamen, which was found to be associated with intuitive characteristics by Gary Nolan at Stanford University. And George Hernandez asked the question whether you can speak about this.
If I remember correctly, that is in the center of the brain, and it has to do with the freeways, if you will, that connect the different parts of the brain. And it's a fascinating finding that Gary Nolan and colleagues found on neuroimaging. And as far as I know in this moment, it needs to be followed up, because there was some question of if that was an artifact or not. And they've had that finding in a very, very specific group of people, like, special ops, military, and abductees, etc. Fascinating finding, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that. We're actually doing a study right now. It's a collaborative study with Columbia University where people upload their neuroimaging files, and they also complete a PSI questionnaire. And so hopefully we'll be able to learn a little bit more about the relationships between PSI experiences and the structure of the brain.
Well, we're just about out of time, Helané. I want to thank you very much for being with me today. I also want to let our viewers know that they can subscribe for free to our weekly newsletter by going to the website of the New Thinking Aloud Foundation, which is newthinkingaloud.org. And that's all one word, and aloud is ALLOWED. I'm going to put all the websites that you mentioned into the description that will accompany this archival video, which will be going public as soon as we end the live stream. So I'll ask you if you wouldn't mind, Helané, to type them into the chat here on Zoom, and then I'll copy and paste them right there into that description. So listeners who are eager to sign up for any of your experiments will have that information in just a few minutes. And we've got a minute left. Do you have a final thought to share with our viewers?
I'm just really grateful to be here with you all today, and just keep exploring, keep going within, tapping into that intuitive self, and being open and curious to what you will find.
Well, very good. And thank you for being with me once again, Helané. For those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
There's a lag, so I think I need to wait about 20 seconds before actually ending the live stream. And that's the tricky part, because I can't tell exactly when. But I'll do it now. There we go. Let's see. And okay.